Discussing Mahler's works and enjoying them as listeners presupposes a very important aspect of research, and that is the music itself, the actual scores that are used in performance. To pursue this further, we take you across the Atlantic to the United States, to Cleveland, Ohio, to talk to Professor Stephen Hefling, co-editor of the new critical edition of the Works of Gustav Mahler, Professor Emeritus of Music at Case Western University, and a colleague of mine for many years. Welcome indeed. First, tell us a little bit about how Mahler published his music. Once a publisher was found, what was the process involved in say, getting a symphony into print?
Well, of course, finding a publisher was no small task at all. And each of Mahler's works had its own difficulties getting into print. But as we know, Mahler did the basic work of composition during the summers. And at the end of a summer, he had what's known as a draft orchestral score or a Partiturentwurf. And he could do the work of writing out the fair copy of the score during the winter. He'd get up early, put in a few hours before he had to go rehearse at the opera. Once he had that, he had a copyist make another copy of it called usually the Stichvorlage, or the printer's copy. And this served two purposes. One, it meant that he had something to show to potential publishers or possibly performers. And two, that it would serve for the engraving. So when he had the luxury of reading through a piece before it went into print, he would ask the publisher to give him a set of proofs. He would have a so-called reading rehearsal, as he did, for example, with the Fourth Symphony, which we're working on right now, make a variety of corrections and get those into the score before it was released and into the parts as well. So that was the basic process.
And then, of course, it was printed. All but the last two of his symphonies, the Liefende Erde and the Ninth Symphony, were published during his lifetime. In other words, he was able to oversee that process.
Right.
But we're still publishing Mahler symphonies. We're publishing so-called critical editions. Why do we still need to be working on these questions if he was part of it?
Well, we need to understand the context here, which is that Mahler made changes in his music every time he performed it. These aren't what we would call structural changes. They're changes to the instrumentation and to the marks of expression. And there are a lot of them. So Erwin Rotz, between about 1960 and 1973, managed to issue editions of all the symphonies except the Eighth. He certainly did his best on this. But since 1973, when Rotz passed away, a lot more material has become available, many more sources that illuminate more about where Mahler was heading with the editing of his music. So that's one thing, the new sources. The new critical edition improves on the formatting of both the score and the parts. It's easier to read, everything's clearer. Up to this time, all Mahler scores were basically reprints of the original materials with paste-up corrections performed as well as they could be. The critical edition now, the new critical edition, is starting over. We have much more extensive critical reports now. In the early days, all Rotz was able to provide was a couple of pages of observations about the materials, because publishers simply didn't want to invest in Mahler. Nobody thought he had much of a future as a composer. That all changed. So our critical reports now are quite extensive. They include not only detailed discussions of individual spots, individual bars in the music, but a history of the composition and the reception during Mahler's lifetime.
So this introduces nuances into the actual music that, if you will, Mahler would have ideally been able to publish. It's one thing to change the parts while you're doing a performance. It's quite another to get the publisher to go back and make a definitive change, even if you're the composer. And even if you're Gustav Mahler, as you said, we often forget the status of Mahler in the musical world today versus back then. He was another composer, appealing to publishing houses, and indeed he needed to go to several during the course of his life to get those works published. And I think we tend to overlook the difficulty of that process. You recently completed the critical edition of Titan, the first version of Mahler's First Symphony. This publication received quite a bit of notice, not only for the prize it received. What was so noteworthy about this project?
Well, we've known for a long time that Mahler twice performed what we think of as the First Symphony under the title of Titan, as we see it there, a tone poem in symphonic form. This had never been published from the sources that Mahler himself used. Several private individuals have made editions, for example, from the autograph full score, which is at Yale University, but Mahler never used that in performance. The source that he used is the one that became the basis for our new edition. And it's quite a fascinating bunch of differences.
But when we talk about the First Symphony, we tend to think, oh, well, the First Symphony is simply Titan without, the lyrical, the second movement. Is there more to it than that?
Yes, in that Mahler issued a program for both the 1893 Hamburg performance and the 1894 Weimar performance. Particularly at Weimar, what the critics saw as the discrepancy between the written program and the music they were hearing was so great that Mahler decided he simply wasn't going to release programs for his music anymore. And he only did so on one occasion in 1907. Otherwise, no commentary from him. So that was certainly a big turning point for him. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So in putting together these critical editions, what would you say, what are some of the greatest challenges in bringing this all together?
Well, the fact that Mahler changed his mind so many times, and you've got to sift through all of that and try to figure out where did he really end up. And even though Mahler is famous for being very detailed, very precise in his markings, he changes those staccato eighth notes to eighth notes followed by 16th rests and so on. He left a lot of things that should have been corrected and never were, sometimes quite surprisingly so. So that's one of the main difficulties.
I have, of course, as someone who also works on Mahler, I hear these accounts of him when he goes to Rome to conduct his music, and he realizes, there are certain players that may not be as strong, or that the acoustics of the hall made him want to double certain parts or to repress a second chair. It really starts to become a very, very subtle, as you said, chasing after shadows, because this might be the Mahler symphony for that hall, but is there another one where he would have again been fiddling with what essentially was his score in front of him?
Probably. I mean, Mahler once said that he'd like to publish new editions of his symphonies every 5 years. No publisher today even would do that. He was constantly rethinking things.
Yeah, and that does also seem to indicate that it's not just a question of the hall or the performer, that his concept of the work is evolving through time. And of course, that really brings into sharp relief the status of the Ninth Symphony and the Lied von der Erde, and of course of the unfinished 10th, those are, in a sense, very raw in their conception, Mahler never having heard those ever performed. They were all in his mind. And we know that once he did get in front of an orchestra, he was very busy making changes. That must be a fascinating concept of, you know, editing a work that he never really heard.
Yes, it does present problems. Though, again, I think we have to remember that he wasn't making changes in the notes. Only very seldom did he make changes in the movement order of a piece. And so you're basically faced with problems of instrumentation and expression and so on. Mm-hmm. Plus, Bruno Walter, who knew him very well and who heard Mahler play Das Lied von der Erde, gave the first performance and had a big hand in the first edition. So he knew what was going on.
Right. When you say you heard him play it, you mean you heard him play it at the piano, or
the piano? Yeah.
Discussed it. Yeah. Yeah. You discussed. You mentioned the upcoming Fourth Symphony. What's next in the project of the new critical edition?
Well, we're going to do a 4-movement First Symphony based on the latest performance indications we have from Mahler. I'm working on Das Lied von der Erde. We're going to have a new edition of that. And after that, we're not quite sure. There are several candidates, one being the Third Symphony, which hasn't been revised since Rotz's issue of it, and the Ninth as well. And of course, Mahler's language in the Ninth Symphony is so complex that it's going to pose real challenges to know whether something might be a mistake or not.
Well, many thanks for this wonderful introduction, Stephen. I think we will need to put together a Mahler spotlight with you and Renate Stark-Voigt, the other editor of the critical edition, for more in-depth discussion of this topic. As we all can hear, there's lots that goes into simply producing the notes that we assume about what Mahler intended. That in itself is an entire field. So thank you very much, Stephen.
My pleasure.